This show is supported by Blueland. We hear a lot about microplastics in oceans and food, but they can also come from products we use every day at home, including cleaning products. Blueland is on a mission to make it easy for everyone to make sustainable choices. Blueland believes that hardworking, clean products can be the norm, not the exception, so that you can do better for your family and the planet at the same time. From cleaning sprays and toilet bowl cleaner to dishwasher and laundry detergent tablets, Blueland's products are independently tested to perform alongside major brands, and the formulas are free from dyes, parabens, and harsh chemicals. You'll love not having to choose between the safe option and what actually gets your house clean. Blueland is a certified B Corp and Leaping Bunny cruelty-free certified. Their formulas are EPA's Safer Choice certified, and many products have also earned Cradle to Cradle's Gold Material Health Certificate. If you're looking to make a small change in your routine, you can get 15% off your first order at blueland.com/prx. Get 15% off your first order by going to blueland.com/prx. blueland.com/prx. This show is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
Everyone conveniently didn't talk about that and talked about, well, COVID did all this, and this is all from COVID. And it's like, you guys, there was a systematic pattern of over-ordering prior to COVID. Like, I feel like we shouldn't ignore this whole lesson and remember that, I think that there was over-ordering behavior well before the pandemic.
I think me and probably a lot of the people were like, yeah, it's been bad, but next year will be better. Next year we'll be out of it. And I was actually just in Germany with a bunch of media event one of our distributors had, and I couldn't believe, multiple bike brands, the bike brand representative from the distributor, and then someone from kind of the German equivalent of like bicycle retailer, all made comments to the effect of like, yeah, this probably won't be turned around until mid 27 or 28. And like, oh shit, I was expecting everyone, can't we all agree it's going to be turned around in 26?
We've never experienced anything like this, not even close. So we've had years, of course, that you've had sales that have decreased or inventory levels that are raised and margin gets compressed and those sorts of things. But we've never had the consistency that has happened both worldwide as well as just the simple bubble itself that was, I think, way bigger than anybody anticipated or expected it to be.
And say COVID didn't cause the problem. It's the problems were already there, and COVID shone a spotlight on them. And that's why we can't recover, because it wasn't a COVID problem. COVID exacerbated an industry problem that already existed. It was almost like COVID pulled the curtain back on the Wizard of Oz. Like, I am the great and powerful mountain bike industry that has been in a bull market for 25 years. We are going to keep growing forever.
From Escape Collective, this is Overnight Success, the podcast about the entrepreneurs, the personalities, and the passionate people who make up the sport of cycling and the stories behind the icons they've built. In our last series, we explored the question of how the bike industry got into such deep trouble during the pandemic. It was a fascinating look up and down all levels of the supply chain that exposed so many troubling aspects of how the bike industry operates and the false optimism that many leaders of some of the largest brands coined the bike gold rush. Everything was supposed to be different in 2024. All that needed to happen was the huge amounts of overstocked inventory needed to run through the belly of the snake and that things would get back to normal. But it didn't. Businesses small and large since then have gone bankrupt. Shops are closing down. Hundreds, possibly thousands of employees have been laid off. Discounting has become the norm. New product development cycles have barely shifted. And from what I've been told, some bike brands can't even give away certain product lines these days. There's even troubling, unsubstantiated rumors that I've been told many times that bikes have even gone into landfill to free up warehousing and to get them off the books. All those people who bought bikes during COVID, they didn't come back. And again, we're largely stuck selling new stuff to the same market. 2025 again was supposed to be different. Optimism that sales would pick up again was wishful thinking. Inventory overruns continued to be a problem, and without turning that aging stock back into cash, liquidity has been a huge challenge for many companies. Now we're here in 2026, and there's optimism again, but it's far more cautious, and maybe it's a capitulation that things are still going to take a while. In this multi-part series, the question has changed from how the bike industry got itself into trouble into why it's still working to get out of it. Over the past few months, myself and my colleague Suvi Loponen have interviewed numerous leaders, owners, and employees inside the industry to understand more about what's going on and why this could be a more systemic problem in the industry that COVID simply exposed and shone a spotlight on, rather than a blip caused by a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic. Suvi, I can't believe we're here talking about this again, but I'm kind of looking forward to getting these interviews out there and giving some insight into what's happening in the bike industry, because this seems like it's gone on for far too long.
Yeah, Wade, I'm excited to get into this as well. And this time, actually, we're looking at how the cycling industry differs from other industries as well, because everyone in the world obviously went through the pandemic, but each individual and each industry experienced it quite differently.
Yeah, we're both exposed to a lot of different industries through friends and former colleagues working in various industries. And while many of those experienced the pandemic as well, that completely mirrored cycling, it just seems that not so many other people are actually talking about the COVID hangover like cycling is. And I kind of assumed they all were. And I asked people and they're like, you guys still talking about COVID?
Yeah, that's very true. And while we have spoken to a lot of experts about this and friends as well about this, we are not necessarily experts in all of what's happening in the industry. So that's why we have talked to all the people that we did.
Yeah, we're lucky we're not really exposed to the same economic forces that the bike industry is. We're sort of sitting adjacent to that. But the bike industry, I'm sick of myself saying that word, but like it sounds like one big happy family and everybody talks and what are you doing and how are you dealing with this problem? But in fact, they don't talk that very much. And we're actually in a very fortunate and unique position that we do speak to a very wide spread of individuals that much more so than many of my friends who do work directly in the bike industry do.
Like you say, it's quite clear that not everyone in the industry talks to each other, and we're in a fortunate position that we really got an insight into all the different things that are going on at the industry at the moment. And some are recovering, some are necessarily not, and most of them are still struggling in one way or another in cycling. So the 4 episodes that we put together, they're really going to shine light into the variety of themes that emerged in all those chats that we had with the industry. And I think it's going to be interesting. It was interesting for us to hear all those, but it's also going to be sharing a lot of things to the broader audience that they like the industry itself hasn't known about. They don't know what others are experiencing, what they're talking about.
Yeah, that was possibly one of the biggest audiences, or at least from feedback we got from the first series, was just this elephant in the room and the relatable experience that everybody went through at the same time that nobody was talking about. So in this first interview, someone who we spoke to in the first series, who was absolutely one of the highlights, her name is Ellery Slater. At that time, Ellery and her husband owned a small independent bike shop in Boulder, Colorado called Sports Garage. And as we all know, Ellery is an absolute firecracker who speaks her mind and has some fantastic insights and really sharp observations. And so since that time, Ellery and her husband have actually sold Sports Garage and exited the bike industry intentionally. We'll speak a little bit more about what led up to that decision in future episodes, but I'll tell you now that it directly relates to the dark clouds that still reign in this industry. Maybe cast your mind back to, when everything was going to change in, late 2023 or 2024. What were you telling yourself and your employees and your team about when things were going to turn around and what needed to happen for that to make it so?
We saw some indicators in early 2024 that there would be a return in a certain segment of our marketplace to full price bikes, like not the entire lineup in the shop, but we saw some indicators that there would be in 2024 a little bit less, let's say, price matching. There'd be some return to like demand for full price bikes, not uniformly, but we did think that some things would start to turn around a little bit. And we were really cautious. When we said turn around, we meant we're going to be able to capture enough margin. Like our margin's going to go, like this is an on paper exercise. In the first series that we did together, we talked about how margins were getting squeezed by like all the price fluctuations, right? And so we saw that like things would smooth out enough that we could actually like just hold a little bit bigger margin, right? And it's largely because there were some gluts of product that needed to be hyper discounted to like keep your balance sheet healthy that we moved through. We made some intentional choices to like keep the balance sheet a little healthier. And so as we moved through all of that, we were like, listen, guys, we don't know what total volume is going to be, but we do know that we've got the shop's inventory in a place where we should be able to capture more margin, and more margin equals more profitability. So my argument for turnaround wasn't so much an industry level turnaround. It was like the microeconomic turnaround. Like we made our balance sheet super healthy. We were in a position where we could capture more margin.
And was margin the main issue at the time, or was it volume, or a little bit of both?
A little bit of both. Volume, the only way to really measure volume, I think in 22, 23 was like looking at unit sales, right? Because you also have a lot of product that need to be discounted. So if you look at total volume of like gross revenue as your volume indicator, it might be misleading. So if you just look at unit sales, there were certain categories of our business where unit sales were the same. And maybe even like in a few categories, like about the same, maybe a little bit higher. Like we had a little bit higher unit sales in e-mountain bikes, right? We had a few categories where unit sales were a little bit lower, even though volume in that category might have been lower because of all the price competition coming out of COVID, so much online inventory, et cetera, right? So I did feel like the very first thing to do to run a healthy business is to get get us back to a position where we could capture as much margin as possible.
Right. Okay.
Which meant not having that COVID inventory hangover that we spoke about, in the first series. Where people were just super loaded up, all the product got delivered, now you got all this stuff, and immediately it's worth less than full margin.
Yeah.
So our first priority was to get us back to where we could capture as much full margin as possible, because that's actually the biggest driver of profitability.
How many times did you have to go and revisit that forecast and that paper exercise as things were rolling out in real life?
So I actually wrote our forecast. I wrote our forecast. I mean, I had to get tons of information from Brad because he ran the sales department, but like I would do our forecasting on both sides of the P&L and just like consult with him all the time and say, what do we think about this? What do we think about that? Where do you see this going? Where do you see that going? And I would work in that forecast. I had it open on my desktop for 2 months. And we're a reasonably small business. Okay. We're a small business. We were core cycling, but I would have that forecast open on my desktop every day for like 2 months because it was so tentative coming out. Like I didn't want to guess anything. I wanted to be like, how many pencils we didn't buy any pencils. I'm kind of making that up, but it's a trope for everything in the business. Like how many chain rings did we buy and how many did we have left? And, like how many bikes with that chain ring did we sell? Because we had so many people that would come to our service business that had bought bikes from us that we could actually use past sales as a little bit of a barometer for like, we knew what bikes we had sold. So we knew, for example, like what drivetrains we'd put out into the universe. We knew how many of those people would come and get back and get their service done to us. And we were like, man, we used to sell a lot of SRAM X01 and those bikes are out there and we haven't seen those guys in a while. And we had these like customers we would kind of follow and we would actually like kind of think about them as like a demographic profile and be like, did they ride a lot last year? Like call Mike Taylor and ask him if he rode a lot last year. Because if he did and he hasn't been in, he's probably going to come in for service. So we would literally have these conversations about like, yeah, we sold a lot of SRAM X01 2 years ago. Let's make sure we have enough X01 chains.
And what were you finding when you called, I can't remember your fictional guy, Mike, or maybe your customer?
Yeah, my fictional guy's name, Mike Taylor.
Yeah. What were you finding when you made those phone calls? Were they riding?
Shocking, riding less.
Right.
Yeah. And we used to actually make this internal, this was like core sport. Again, this is our microcosm. Our microcosm was the core sport of mountain biking on the Front Range of Colorado. I think it was fatigue from crowds on the trail. Those were really stressful times. And so we saw that there were people actually riding less. We started kind of low key being pickleball haters. Because we this one week when we talked to 2 or 3 customers, we'd be like, "Hey man, how's it going?" And they'd be like, "Oh yeah, you gotta we've been playing pickleball."
Yeah.
And I can remember my husband goes in and he goes, "We're literally losing clients to pickleball."
No way.
And I'm like, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He's like, and he listed like customers, and they're like, "Well, we didn't ride as much because we started playing pickleball."
Huh.
And so, it seems kind of funny, but like if you think about trends, there was a day when golf was losing people to cycling. And in our community, some cyclists were like playing pickleball. So I'm not saying that these are like things that happen at like on a global level, right? I'm using like our tiny microcosm to say, hey, if you started checking in on your target audience, people changed during COVID and their behaviors changed, and not all of them snapped back to their pre-COVID behaviors.
What were some other behaviors that changed? Were people coming to the shops wanting to buy that chain ring, or did they stop coming in because?
Single biggest behavioral change.
How so?
Our business grew and earned its reputation because we had a best-in-class demo fleet.
Okay.
Where people would come in, they knew our demo program. They came because we had enough good technology in the categories that they wanted to buy a mountain bike in, that they could demo 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different bicycles and choose between different aspects of technology to be really confident that they were buying the right bike. And in 2018 and 2019, we had on average about 60 bikes in our demo fleet. And on a Friday, because you could pick up a bike on a Friday and you'd bring it back on a Monday, and we charged you for the weekend. And we were like, ride the bike where you want to ride the bike. And we would block our entire calendar on Friday and we would like set up demos. Set them up, set their sag, take their body weight, measure the handlebars, measure the saddle height, dial the bike in. On an average weekend in 2018 and 2019, out of those 60 to 65 demo bikes, on average, 45 to 50 were in the field. Like that's how many demos we would set up.
Wow.
The shop looked empty. All the demo bikes were like in the field. Demo volume decreased by 80% pre and post COVID.
Do you have a theory why?
We still talk about it sometimes. We're like, that is such a huge number. And that's like a number that was pulled off of like, I can just run that SKU out of our register, right? Like I can just look at like demos because we would charge for the demo and I could see demo volume, right? I could also come in on a Saturday and see how many bikes were hanging on the hooks. And it was more than half. There were some weekends where we would look at like that same weekend, let's say third weekend in June 2018, third weekend in June 2019, third weekend in June 2024, and it would literally be off like 80%. It was a phenomenal number.
What changed, do you think?
I think during COVID, when people got a little traumatized by their bike buying experience, like they'd pay a deposit and then they'd wait 60 days, 90 days, 100 days to get their bicycle. I also think that there really are that many bikes available online and in secondary markets. And I also think that people lost patience for the process. And I also think that like bike technology just like everybody kind of caught up with one another. For some reason, I wish this is the mystery that I would love to answer about what happened inside our bike business with like pre and post COVID behavior is, why did demo volume decrease so much? And I think I can tell you one of the reasons that I definitely know for sure, listeners, this is just the data inside my shop. And so what I'm going to share with you is literally like my lived life experience.
Okay.
And the reason I say listeners carefully is because it is genderized. Where we did have and maintain demo volume was women. And we started to create this internal philosophy that our male customers, because they had demoed, because we tended to be, we were on the higher end and usually we were not someone's first bike purchase, right? So again, I want to be very careful to everyone know that I can only speak to what my area of expertise is, right? And like we were a niche high-end enthusiast shop. Now all of a sudden, you've got companies that went direct to consumer during COVID that had never been direct to consumer before. You had more people selling and buying bikes online, including their previous technology, meaning like, I'm a rider, I'm going to sell my bike on Pink Bike or eBay or, Facebook Marketplace or whatever. What we saw is a lot of our male identifying male customers come in being like, hey, I bought this bike online. Would you guys like overhaul the drivetrain for me? Right? Or I bought this bike online. Can you guys help me set the suspension? Right. And so I feel that we had a lot of male customers who felt like they had enough knowledge that now the experience of demoing was less valuable to them in comparison to how much money they could save buying a bike online that was being clearanced out by a big manufacturer or being sold by someone in a secondary market. And so everybody has this personal utility function. And so I feel like we had a lot of male customers for whom their personal utility function swung to how much they could save online. And it eclipsed the personal value function of like, I want to ride that bike. I want it set up for me and I want to feel it. Like I want to get on the bike. I want to get my butt in the saddle and I want to go ride the bike. And like, that's how I know I'm going to make a decision. I think we had a lot of male customers that were like, well, that's such a good savings that maybe I don't need to ride it before I buy it.
Huh.
Plus I can always go in and like have them set it up. I can get my service done, but we didn't see a drop off necessarily in the volume of women that came into demo.
Okay.
Women were still valuing the opportunity to ask questions, learn about the technology, ride the bike before they bought it. We just saw that like our female customers weren't at the point yet where they were ready to be like, I know enough. I'll just buy that bike off of Pink Bike.
Yeah. Okay.
And we actually had conversations about that standing on the showroom floor. Like one day my husband looked at me and he goes, I just set up 5 demos and they were all women, like one after another. They were all female clients. There were a couple weekends. So what was very interesting was our demo volume decreased. But when we looked at the gender mix of the volume that we were doing in demos, it was disproportionately women, meaning relative to like pre-COVID. So I do think that like my personal explanation about what happened to demo was that the personal utility function, like, I don't know, I loved economics. The utility function of our core client, there was so much money to be saved online or in a secondary market that the utility of the savings eclipsed the utility of like putting their butt on that bike and riding it before they decided to order it.
Interesting. What was the realization process that things weren't happening the way you were hoping it would?
We were watching our sales, our unit sales, and we were having these conversations. Like we would call our customers. I know, shocking that we would look for specific feedback from our demographic. Like, I mean, keep in mind, I'm saying that very tongue in cheek because really good companies should always be doing this, whether you're a tiny company or a big company, right? You should stay in touch with the people that you want to be your audience, right? So we would stay in touch with our audience. We would go ride. Sometimes we would just call people and be like, oh my gosh, haven't heard from you in forever. How are you doing? How's your new Mondraker writing? Like, are you loving it? And like, just keeping in touch with our audience, right? So from doing that and looking at our own volume, we definitely had a POV that the brick and mortar retailer was going to be facing stiffer competition online. Okay. And so we knew that we were going to lose some market share to the internet, more than we had lost before COVID.
More specifically, are you talking about the brands themselves who are literally your vendors as well?
Well, yeah. I mean, sometime in 2000 and I'm going to say 22, could have been 23. I'm just having like a clear memory lapse here for a second. But I do remember specifically how
There's
it went down.
There's a big blob of time with COVID.
There's a blob. And in that blob, exactly, in that blob of time, Yeti Cycles went direct to consumer out of Golden, Colorado.
Yeah.
And to their credit, they called us before they pulled the lever, before they pushed the button, right? They called us and they said, hey, you guys are a big dealer. We've been, and full disclosure and with respect to Yeti, because we do love the brand, they don't officially publish a like top 10 dealer list. Anecdotally, we know we're usually in there. And we know there were a couple of years we were either number 1 or number 2. And they told us. So, okay. So let's just say we sell a lot of Yetis. And historically, we've sold a lot of Yetis. And we've been a Yeti dealer since 2004.
Okay.
So 20 years. So Yeti called and said, we're going to go direct to consumer. We're letting our important dealers know. Come on down to Golden. Let's have a conversation about this. So we had a personal conversation with them. And they let us know they were selling direct to consumer. And we were like, okay, this is going to hurt us. And we talked in great detail and specifics about it. Bookmark that, Wade, because we should talk about direct to consumer policies and warranty.
Oh, it's coming. Yes. I got a good question. Yes.
And so we knew that they were going to direct to consumer. And we did see a decrease in our Yeti sales. And we anecdotally spoke to fellow Yeti dealers around the state. And they had this like they would go from like, well, we did like 40 units last year and we did like 6 units the year after. So there was an impact. And then much later, confidentially, someone at Yeti let us know that, they launched direct to consumer thinking that they were going to be able to sell bikes in markets where they didn't have a really good dealer, right? Let's say, I'm going to pick on Iowa. Let's say that there's not a great mountain bike dealer in Iowa, but you've got Yeti fans in Iowa. And to Yeti's credit, I think Yeti has done an amazing job building their online audience, their brand awareness, their storytelling. Like, I really do think they're exceptional in creating access to their culture online, if you're a mountain biking fan. And so it was a logical conclusion that you might be able to capture sales in other markets where you see, through your statistics that like you've got, if you geo-target your followers, it might be, we don't have a dealer there, so maybe we can capture some sales in those areas. But the problem is that you're actually most likely to sell to someone online for a $10,000 purchase that already knows the brand, that's already ridden the brand, that knows what they're buying. And so someone inside the company confidentially let us know that a great deal of their online sales actually came from Colorado.
Yeah, wow. What strikes me about speaking to Ellery is that she's not describing a business that just got blindsided. She knew what was happening. She had forecasts open. For months, she was literally calling customers to find out if they were still riding. And what she kept on finding is that behavior changed. A lot of them weren't riding. They had drifted. They went to pickleball, golf, less time on the trail. It's just so disappointing. And it's the kind of behavioral change that you just can't plan for. And it's just completely out of their control. So here's what we keep coming back to. She saw the signals, she acted on them, and sadly, she had to get out of business because of those signals.
And I think that's a very good point that she brings up, that you can do literally everything. And many say that the industry hasn't tried to even get out of this glut. But Ellery's a very, very good source telling she did everything she could, but you cannot predict, like she says, you can't predict what people are going to do, their behavior. That's a very hard thing to forecast.
Yeah.
It's a tough time for everyone in the industry.
Yeah. When the customers moved on, like, what do you do about that? That's a bigger problem than just business. So the question of this episode really isn't what went wrong. We covered that last time. But the question is why recovery is taking so long and whether recovery is even the right framing. Because this person I spoke to next, he's not a retailer. He's sitting further up the chain at a brand level. And what's interesting with talking to him is that he was doing something many people in the industry maybe weren't thinking about, not that I heard of, I'm sure some were, but he was thinking more broader on a macroeconomic terms and scenario planning with his team.
So who do we talk to next?
This guy he's an old friend of mine named Cam Whiting, and he's always talking about this stuff, like even in his personal life when we sit down for a coffee, and he kind of worries about it like he does the weather. So take that into context, and that's what I love about Cam. But I think his thinking here was spot on with his concerns, and he's worked in senior roles with some very well-known enthusiast brands. BMC, way back in the Cycling Tips days, it was my first encounter with him, and we became friends and colleagues ever since. He's also done 10 years with Scott Bikes, both at HQ in Switzerland and currently with Scott Australia, running the business here. He's worked for POC as well, and he's also done loads of independent consulting for various parts of the industry. So again, he's someone I've known since the early days of my entrance into the bike industry, so to speak. And I want to stress here, though, that his views are personal and through his vast experience, not his employer's views. So he wanted to make that clear. I want to make that clear. But what he told me about how he was reading the signals, as early as 2022 is genuinely striking.
I tend to look through sort of an macroeconomic lens, which sounds a bit wonkish, but I remember quite clearly we would have weekly meetings with the team, the company I worked for at the time, and I would be sharing, some headlines from economic forecasters, people making projections, and basically walking the team through scenarios that could unfold after the surge that we saw, this massive shift in demand that acted as a tailwind for the industry and then very quickly turned into a headwind. So I do recall sharing some slides based on some historical data of here's what might happen, here's what unfold now that interest rates are starting to lift, and people are returning to pre-existing habits. And that was probably quite a new type of discussion to some of the members in my team that they hadn't encountered, and probably some number of them were thinking, why are we talking about this? But I just felt it was important to try and educate people and make them aware of the potential consequences of what we've just been through and how we might prepare for that.
What were some of those macroeconomic headlines that you remember just putting forth as a potential risk that the kind of world was going through at the time that might affect the bike industry?
So actually, there's one chart that I recall. It was actually an infographic, and it illustrated the path of a recession, essentially. And I think some commentators felt very strongly that we were entering a recession where, interest rates would go meaningfully higher than what they were during COVID, which is like a zero interest rate era for a lot of developed countries. And, first people would start cutting down on the discretionary spending, and then some people would probably lose their jobs because companies, as discretionary spending goes down, then companies sell these things. And then as they sell these things, they have less money coming in. With less money coming in, they had to cut some costs, and some of those costs might be people, and those people stop spending money because there's no income. And then house prices start to fall because some people be levered up with mortgages and no longer have a job, so they have to sell their house. And it was really just the snowball effect that I was trying to illustrate. And then just bringing that back into the context of our industry, because we are in the business of selling products that are highly discretionary. In some cases, what's unique about cycling, it is both a recreation and it is a transportation or means of transportation for some people. So, there's some resilience, I guess, in some portion of the consumer base that we serve who might need a bike to get to work, for example. But for the majority, people are buying our products because they love doing that thing, and we might just need to be comfortable with the fact that, and this is sort of the message I was trying to communicate to my team, there will be a portion of the consumer base who we have served during COVID who've come to us as new participants, and they may not want to stick around. And that's going to impact our business, and we have to react to that.
I remember in 2024 when, the cloud of COVID and lockdowns and everything lifted and the world was back open for business, but the headwinds, as you describe, were fully in effect. There were a lot of people saying that, okay, well, this year we're going to recover and next year's going to be good. How many times have you personally had to revise your expectations about when this ends for the bike industry or your company that you were working for at the time in particular?
I always reflected on what happened during the first couple of years of COVID and how unpredictable that was as a lens through which we tried to forecast for the future. And what that actually means is that it just isn't possible, to really have very clear definition. Of course, we would have annual forecasts that we would have to set in terms of, okay, these are the commercial targets that we're aiming for. You try to just be as conservative as you possibly could in terms of, okay, we have these variables that are within our control, but then there are a lot more that are external factors that we don't. So let's take a very conservative approach to how we think about what the next year might look like. And a lot of the people who I speak within the industry, trade shows or retailers, there was this narrative that next year will be different. It's going to be better next year. So, well, why? Show me. What are you seeing that gives you that confidence? And whenever I travel didn't happen for a long time, but once we started getting back on planes, going to exhibitions and Taipei Cycle, for example, you just read the room and you knew things are not going to turn around in a year. and all the information that we were getting from suppliers and people who were in the value chain, much closer to the raw material than to the consumer, what they were telling us gave me no comfort at all that it would be a quick turnaround. We just needed to factor that into how we thought about the next 12 months. And fortunately, because of that conservative approach, didn't have to deal with, large step downs or step ups in expectations.
You spoke of some signals that might give you some indication of where things or when things might change or how they might change. What signals or data points were you looking at that might have indicated positive or negative news to you?
So it's a little multifaceted. So again, coming back to this sort of more macro view, if you believe that high interest rates are an issue for consumer discretionary spend, if you believe that unemployment rising is not a great condition for, success when it comes to commercial outcomes, monitoring those indicators and things that we cannot control is important, in terms of signal. You're looking for signs of whether or not it's credit card activity, what are people spending their money on, and where. How's the housing market? Because at least in Australia and New Zealand, where I operate in the industry, a lot of people's wealth is tied up in their homes. So looking for softness in the housing market, how much surplus household savings there are. So again, a little bit wonkish, but necessary to understand how is the health of the consumer. And then from an industry-specific lens, closure of retail stores, aging inventory building up in the market. And we have far from perfect data, Wade, in the industry. You really have to make a very meaningful effort to just try to piece together some dots, and you still will never get close to a perfect picture. At least I cannot. Maybe someone much smarter can help to understand.
It's a recurring theme that nobody has or very few have.
And part of that is the value chain in the industry is so fragmented. We don't get perfect flow through of data. But you're certainly looking at the health of physical retail stores. We are a better or worse, very close industry in terms of, you have a drop of water in the pond and it ripples across the whole pond at pace, so you're always hearing things. So keeping your eyes and ears open, passing anecdotes that come to you, what's actually real, what's noise and what's signal. And certainly when you're hearing about store closures, when you're hearing about someone's got this massive pile of inventory, and even when you're seeing it, the cadence of promotions and sales campaigns, that's very clear. You cannot hide, a 60% off sale.
They don't want to.
No. So you're really trying to follow trend, momentum across the industry, as well as with the backdrop of what's happening in the general economy.
Thanks for tuning in to Overnight Success and our special industry series. The rest of this episode is free to listen to, but the remaining 4 episodes will be exclusive to Escape Collective members. They are the people who fully fund everything we do. That independence from the sport and industry we cover is exactly what makes work like this possible. It's by design. If you value that and want to hear lots more of it, please head to escapecollective.com/overnightsuccess, all one word, and become a member today for 50% off the annual price for a limited time. Thank you.
I think Cam and Ellery's perspectives are really great in highlighting the differences in how the cycling industry can and has to pay attention to the macroeconomics if it wants to really predict or forecast anything. But it's also clear that there are simply so many players involved in everywhere in the cycling industry, and the whole value chain, the supply chain, it's really long and big. And depending on what level, what stage you are on that chain, you probably look at things differently. You have different sorts of access to data and what you're predicting, what you're forecasting with.
Yeah, if there's one recurring thing that I keep hearing from people in private conversations, it's just the fragmentation of the data that people receive. And it's a lot of other industries have figured it out, and that partially could be because they're much more vertically integrated, and that just doesn't happen in the bike industry for many good reasons, actually. But it is a recurring theme, but it's a solvable problem too, right? We've certainly seen that. So who do we have next, Suvi? Who's our next guest? Who did you speak to?
I spoke with someone who's an industry veteran. So the CEO of one of the UK's largest distributors, Madison. So Dominic Langan has been dealing with all this for 30-something years. And although he did admit to me that, yeah, this is one of the hardest times he's ever experienced in his career, he did have some optimism in him as well about the recovery. But it was clear, it was kind of linked to what Cam was saying about the global macroeconomic situation. He was talking about how the global conflicts are influencing the cycling industry. It's just basically been one thing after another that's hit the industry, and that's really, really made it a hard time for everyone. But yeah, there's little sprinkles of recovery as well. One important thing that he's going to point out, and we're going to chat about, is inventory. That's probably going to be one of the most divisive topics that we're going to keep coming back to. Again, there's not very global data on what the inventory levels are, and that's why there's so many different opinions on what the inventory situation is actually like.
Well, I think we are slowly recovering. It definitely started to notice a pickup in the market towards the end of last year, and that continued into this year, although we're now obviously dealing with some extra things we weren't planning for with the war with Iran, which isn't helping for sure. But I think generally speaking, there was definitely a fragile but clear start of the recovery in the last quarter. I think even the recovery probably started a little bit at the beginning of last year, and the first quarter of last year was pretty strong. But then I think we had budgets and various things that just increased business costs and just caused a lot of sort of uncertainty for business, and they kind of hit the mood. Even though we had a fantastic summer of weather, I think that kind of had a negative impact with national insurance cost increases and minimum wages and all these things that are impacting a lot of retailers and every business, but particularly in smaller retailers, is another big increase for them. So I think all of those factors kind of took its toll a little bit, but it seemed to then, as the year went on, people sort of kind of got used to it or adapted as necessary. And it was definitely a more positive trend towards the end of the year. And certainly in the first part of this year and at our trade show in February at Ice Bike, the mood was very positive and very well attended, and a very different sort of tone of voice coming from the retailers that they were looking for new ideas and different things to do in their business, whereas for the last couple of years they really weren't open to anything new, quite resistant to anything that was a risk, say, because they weren't confident about it, so they were keeping everything very tight. So whereas this year they were definitely open to thinking, how can I sort of spice things up a little bit in from a retail point of view and start attracting more customers and growing the business. So there was a different mindset definitely in February. I think possibly the scale of inventory that was produced during COVID just exceeds, I think, most people's expectations. I think there was just so much more produced. Even then, it was probably last year when I went to Taichung in September that I really started to fully appreciate quite how much inventory there still was and how much had been made. So it was, that was kind of, after that I was a bit depressed that I knew then, and certainly for budgeting for this year, that I knew there was a lot more still to come. And I think that's kind of also linked with the tariffs that probably about this time last year, was around the time of sort of COTA, so April time, that President Trump started imposing all these tariffs. And I think that obviously made a lot of producers in Asia have to rethink where that product's going to go. And I think that's just another thing to hit us on the head, which, we probably could have seen a stronger recovery in 25 had there still not been so much inventory probably redirected, or just because of tariffs going to the US, some of that product definitely made it to Europe and to UK as a consequence. Mm-hmm. So I think, I think it was just the scale of the volume. the amount of bikes that must have been produced during COVID and thereafter was phenomenal, and just way over and above what most people would realize, I think. And it was only sort of as time gone on we realized quite how much there's been.
Yeah, it is crazy. I was just reading about Trek's figures. I think those came out already a couple of years ago, but how much inventory it is, and it was some 8 million bikes pretty much that they're still having in kind of overstock, and it's just crazy.
It's all going to go somewhere. And there's obviously also inventory that where businesses have subsequently gone bust or or disappeared or reneged on orders, and that's inventory. Even last September was still out in, say, Taiwan. So I don't know what was out in other countries, but in Taiwan we were being offered other bike brands for very discounted prices if we would take it. So that was because the factories were stuck with them.
I read this morning that chairman of the Taiwan Bicycle Association gave the statement to Bike Europe that the inventory issue is gone. I read that sentence and I was like, it's not what I've heard. So
maybe within Taiwan it may have gone. I'm not sure it's gone from all the other countries. It's definitely less than it was, but there's still the last time I went round some bike factories was last September, and their production was probably at a third of capacity, and they still sitting on stocks for brands. So I mean, there are some pockets of production still going on. So it is, some categories are back to normal, and probably higher end road would be one of those. So I think Taiwan tends to do the higher end of bikes. So, I guess that may be in a slightly better shape than other areas, but I'm pretty sure, I wouldn't say it's all gone, but maybe compared to what it was, he probably feels quite confident.
Yeah. And how was the mood? Because you mentioned Ice Bike. Ice Bike was optimistic, so that's more kind of the domestic UK market. But how was Taipei? How was the mood there?
I would say the mood was better than it was last year. Certainly the factories we were talking to were definitely feeling a bit more positive. They're getting a few more orders coming in, so that from that point of view, they're happy. However, they are very nervous because they're now, and there was quite a lot of talk of price increases, which is the last thing we really need as an industry. And as we've sort of got quite a fragile recovery going on, the thought of further increases when the consumer is under a lot more financial pressure, cost of living and so on, is really something we don't want to see. But basically, cost of aluminium, steel, anything that uses a lot of energy to produce, oil, etc., all of those things are going up. And we're also seeing already the sort of increased costs in freight. So it is quite concerning unless this finishes very quickly. It's just been a constant challenge of just trying to manage a business through completely unpredictable waters constantly. And, you go in with a plan, and it's almost like now when I do my budget commentaries each year, I just say, well, subject to, we don't have a nuclear war or, who knows what, then yes, this is probably achievable, but who knows what's coming. I think the biggest impact really is just what it does to the consumer mood and just consumer confidence. And that's the thing that's been battered now for pretty much since COVID. With oversupply, I think, everyone's got this 2020 hindsight now, but you're a brave person to sort of say, well, the COVID boom is going to stop on this date. And even when our forecasting, we knew it was going to stop at a point, but we kind of did expect it to be a gradual sort of decline and back to a more normal sort of level of business. But it literally dropped off a cliff. It was a sheer drop. And I think the UK reacted really quickly. I think Europe was a bit slower to react. And it varied obviously by country, but they had some quite strict rules, whereas the UK kind of wasn't so strict. When we came out of COVID, the UK also reacted to going back to how it used to be very, very quickly. And Europe was still carrying on having a nice cycle boom. And we were talking with brands out there, and they were seeing our forecasts, and they go, we don't understand what's going on, because like here, it's still great, blah, blah. And then about 3 months later, it hit Europe as well. So I think, and then they go, oh, right, okay, we see what's happening. Yeah, I think the buying of stock, I know from what we did from our point of view, you then read later, like you were saying earlier, some of the big global brands, how much they were buying, but obviously they got global markets. But from our point of view, we did overbuy, but nowhere near to that extent. I'm not sure that anything has really gone, nothing in COVID sort of, I guess the only thing we hoped during COVID is that it would change people's lifestyle habits, but actually the minute they could get back in the car and go back to normal, they did.
There's something almost exhausting about what Dominic describes. I mean, gosh, you're planning a budget, you're seeing green shoots, and then there's a new war or tariffs or freight costs skyrocketing. And he literally said at one point, like, who knows what's coming? And that just being a planning assumption, right? And that's no different for anywhere. And it's not unique to bikes, but gosh, I don't envy that challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really the industry has really been putting out fires left, right, and center. It feels the cliff drop from COVID was one, and yeah, like you said, tariffs, inventory, price increases. What I found really interesting from speaking with Dom was that point about the opinions on the scale of what's happening, especially when it comes to, for example, the inventory. You hear one thing from one person and another thing from another person. They're completely conflicting views on what the truth is, and there's no real data to tell that, okay, one is right and one is wrong, and maybe they're both correct to some extent. It's also telling that everyone in the market experienced this differently. Like Asian companies, they might have had a different kind of timeline on how they recovered, how they experienced the COVID boom and bust. And European brands, even UK, there's a difference between UK and mainland Europe. So
totally,
it's whoever you speak to, they're going to tell you a slightly different story.
And speaking of different markets, it brings up another topic that I want to dive into a later episode, and it's the rise of the Chinese brands and the timing of the XDSs and the Windspaces and stuff. They're not new, but they're also getting very, very popular very quickly. And a lot of these Chinese brands are getting to be good reputations, well recognized, and coming up. With so many orders being canceled and pushed back by Western brands, and the timing of these Chinese brands who are vertically integrated and popping up after COVID, I'm really curious to find out if the situation has directly contributed to giving rise to now massive competitors from China and exacerbating the problem. That's something we'll look into later. I have interviews lined up to hear more on that, and I don't have a clear answer on that yet. But it brings us to probably the most counterintuitive conversation of this whole episode, because against that backdrop, the same backdrop that's crushing a lot of businesses, Josh Portner from Silca is having a grand old time. Josh is growing staff, increasing business. He's signing world tour team sponsorships. He's opening warehouses across different continents. And he's a good example of someone running a solid business, planning for future events before they happen, and being ruthlessly honest with himself in the business about what's performing and what's not.
Yeah, I think we can all agree that Josh is ruthlessly honest. he's a great source for us, and yeah, been in the industry for a long time and can look at it from many different perspectives. And I think the business side, like you said, that's one of the really key points that Josh was pointing out to us, is that it came up actually in a lot of our interviews that the way that the cycling industry operates isn't necessarily focused on business always. It's a very much a passion industry, and people are drawn into it because of that. And part of how Josh attributes their success is the way that he runs Silca. So he has this like business first, bike second attitude, and he's got really good mentors that help him in growing the business. And it does seem like that's helped him kind of steer the business in the right direction in these quite difficult years.
Broad question. How would you describe the broader cycling industry right now?
Oh, I'll steal from The Economist and say K-shaped. I really had projected, I think, as had so many people, we would be through the ugly by now. A couple of years ago when I talked to Wade about this, I think me and probably a lot of the people were like, yeah, it's been bad, but next year will be better. Next year we'll be out of it. And I was actually just in Germany with a bunch of media with event one of our distributors had, and I couldn't believe, multiple bike brands, the bike brand representative from the distributor, and then someone from kind of the German equivalent of like bicycle retailer all made comments to the effect of like, yeah, this probably won't be turned around until mid 27 or 28. And like, oh shit, I was expecting everyone, can't we all agree it's going to be turned around in 26? And it's certainly much worse for some than others. The e-bike brands, particularly in Europe. Not naming names, but I mean, people are saying, hey, we're sitting on 24 plus months of inventory, or people who have e-bike factories or assembly factories they built in Europe that they're just using as storage. That is darn expensive storage, right? That is a wild swing. And so, yeah, we're still hearing, I would say the bigger you are and the more connected to built, assembled bicycle you are, the worse it is for you right now. So, I mean, those companies feel like they're bottom leg of the K. Of my small company friends, I would say it's a mix of how well are you operating your business, and the bike industry being the bike industry, that is really all over the place. You've got some excellent operators out there, but you really have a lot of enthusiasts who had a good idea, who are more into the bicycle and the industry side of their business than into the running the business side of the business. And those people at the moment are really struggling. But yeah, we've grown quite a bit. I think the smartest thing we did was during COVID, towards the end of COVID, when the industry was just really killing it, and everybody was making money, right? I mean, it was definitely like, they talk about the old, like, was it the Pennsylvania oil drilling? Like you could put a screwdriver in the ground and oil would come out, and that was where the industry was. Everybody was just drunk on like, you make a product, you say it's for bicycles, and money rains down. One of the things that we were really busy trying to figure out was, okay, this doesn't last forever, right? I mean, it can't last forever, even though people all around us were saying that. I mean, some really big industry players were like, oh, this goes to 2027. Like, dude, do the math, man. Like that, it's not possible.
One of the things Josh said that stuck with me, and I hadn't heard this before, but during the COVID boom, it was like Pennsylvania oil drilling, and you just put a screwdriver in the ground and money rains down. I hadn't heard that before, and I liked it. But even with hindsight being 2020 now, it's still not obvious what the right strategy was. Take Shimano and SRAM, for example. They both took two polar opposite approaches during the COVID boom. Now, they're not exactly equal comparisons, but it's kind of worth pointing out. Shimano, from what I understand from people within the company, they grow at 5% per year, and they stayed disciplined and conservative to that number in the COVID boom. In the podcast series we did last time, we heard stories of SRAM massively overproducing to satisfy demand and potentially got their heads over their skis. Yet, there are certain signs now that SRAM has taken away market share from Shimano in certain categories, and when I speak to people within SRAM, all their inventory levels are back to normal, and they're not really talking about COVID anymore. And they're doing quite well from all accounts. They're a private company, so it's hard to truly know, but Shimano being public we can see they've shown meaningful declines in revenue, and they only look to be recovering now. It complicates things because of the foreign exchange losses due to the weak Japanese yen, which is significant. But what was the better approach? Well, it's kind of hard to say.
And it is like the oil drilling, I guess that's the key in it, that the oil's probably not going to keep flowing forever. So everyone tried a different approach to get the oil, and what was right and what was wrong it's not clear. And it's affected everyone across the supply chain. So whoever took what direction, and a lot of brands have kept changing their direction. So they've maybe gone direct to consumer or shifted their retail brick and mortar versus online sales and all of this. And they keep changing because no one really knows what is going to work and what is not going to work.
Next, we're going to bring back Ellery, because she had more to say about what's permanently changed at the retail, which I found really, really interesting. Specifically about what happened when her biggest brands that she sold at her shop launched their own direct-to-consumer channels and became both her customer or her vendor and her competitor. And she has a very specific viewpoint on what that meant for her business and what it signals for the retail relationship more broadly. Where you sit now, maybe you have a better view, but what are your thoughts on, in the bike shop retail space, what's structurally different now than compared to, say, before COVID in 2019? Is there anything that stands out to you?
Yeah. I think I remember saying the first time we spoke that my first experiences in the bike industry, I realized how the bike industry were slow adopters of certain, let's just say like sales channel practices or just business practices in general. The one thing that is structurally different is prior to COVID, a brick and mortar retailer, it was sort of unevenly distributed how that retailer faced pressure from online sales. And I'm connecting that back to the idea of the bike industry being slower adopters, because at the time that I began working in brick and mortar bike shops, almost every ski shop, they had an online competitor for like one of the brands in their stores. But in the bike world, you might have 2 or 3 brands who are not selling direct to consumer yet. And perhaps the only online pressure you had was they used like backcountry or competitive cyclist as a deep hole to get rid of excess inventory. And so then maybe a model that you had on the floor was also on backcountry. Or, maybe you did business with a brand that had started on the early days of what was then smart e-tailing with the shop local now integration with like a Giant or a Trek or something like that. But the idea that you were in a truly omni-channel environment was really unevenly distributed around the retailer world before COVID. Now, I think structurally at the brick and mortar level, every brick and mortar retailer is operating in an omni-channel environment, whether they realize it or not. And I do think that's a structural difference that was accelerated by COVID.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, I actually think the question of what's permanently changed and what's structurally changed in the way that I view those questions are a little different, because the structural changes, maybe they were inevitable and COVID accelerated them. My first answer to like what's permanently changed is that COVID's just now a part of our institutional memory. And it was, think of all the conversations that we had when we had the, what went wrong conversation. What's permanently changed is like all of that chaos is part of the institutional memory of the bike shop owners that are still, doing business, right? And it isn't for the manufacturers as well. But if you combine those two, the structural changes of existing in an omni-channel environment and, the permanent change of the whole COVID experience in the bike industry now being a part of our institutional memory, underlying that are some dangerous things that I think that we have to consider, right? Now you have more pressure and you have memories of a very challenging time where you maybe didn't share a perspective with your manufacturer partners. And I think that it has degraded loyalty in the sales channel. I think it's degraded loyalty actually in both directions.
Yeah, right. How did the whole pawn specialized Trek purchasing of retailers affect the retail landscape, at least in the US? Did that enter any dynamic that made things different, or was that just sort of a side thing? Because they're all of those companies seem to be in some trouble because of that, or in part because of that. Did that hurt other bike shops as well?
In the near term, like let's say when Pawn made an acquisition, because we did have some specialized, there was a Trek-owned store in what I considered our geographic market, and then there were 3 more stores that fell under Pawn or specialized ownership during the time period that you're talking about, Wade. And in the short run, it became challenging when like that retailer on the surface looks like a local bike shop, but now because they're integrated, like if you happen to be an independent bicycle dealer that was flooring the exact same models, let's say as a Pawn-owned store, they could sell now in person more easily at the same price that they could sell online. And so if you were really if you happened to like be a retailer with a Pawn brand and now a Pawn-owned store pops up in your marketplace, now that price, the margin structure for a Pawn-owned store was different than our margin structure because it's all vertically integrated. So, I mean, that's kind of the most obvious and most immediate impact was just, wow, like we can't compete with that. If it were a vertically integrated experience.
Yeah.
So I think that was the first thing. Like you said, like they're kind of struggling because of that entrance into bike shops. And while I was traveling this last year in the van, I went by 2 closed, out of business, specialized owned stores.
Right.
Specialized, owned retailers. So we saw those fail. Probably, I don't know if it's at a higher rate. I don't have any statistics to back that up. I certainly haven't looked to see if specialized or Trek or Pawn owned bike shops failed at rates higher than independently owned bike shops. I have no statistics under that. But I do know anecdotally that part of the independent bicycle retailer culture is that there's like a stakeholder with a personal connection to the community that sort of builds the culture, builds the reputation, builds the relationships. And I think that once you're a corporate owned bike shop, there's a transition period where you're also now just corporate employees and you're not local bike shop employees. And so I think there probably was some like cultural friction in that transition, which may have affected customers actually more than competitors.
Yeah. I believe we spoke last time, and you alluded to it this time about I think in the omni-channel world we live in, how that's changed the customer fundamentally. Can you talk more about how you view that change and what customers expect and what their behavior is now?
Yeah, this is a nice big fat can of worms to talk about because, when we talked about the fact that like structurally participating in an omni-channel environment was sort of unevenly distributed around the bike retailer world, and now it's uniformly distributed, we can talk about a lot of different things. One of the things that we noticed was that as bikes, like the same brands that customers used to have to come and see us for, were now more readily available online or available on more sites online. We're just going to call direct to consumer the channel, but then you can have multiple sites within the channel. We did notice some consumer behavioral change, particularly as the online environment had much lower prices. Since we're still talking about like, why can't we recover? We can't talk about the omnichannel environment without talking about the fact that manufacturers dumped a lot of inventory online. And when I mean dumped, I mean, it was like dirt cheap. And it was really, really cheap. And one of the things that we saw is we saw a behavioral change in our demo fleet. We noticed that our volume decreased, like the pre and post COVID, a structural change that may have been just unique to our own shop and that was impacted by the omni-channel.
What Ellery just described there is really the experience of watching the ground shift in real time. That's what many, many people in the industry have described. It's just, you worked with brands and you worked in the field for decades, 20 years, but at the same time, everything around you is shifting and you just have to adapt to that.
Yeah, which is maybe the perfect setup for the next conversation I had. The next interview is Jake Dudek. He spent years inside the cycling industry. He was at Weagle, Chain Reaction, Backcountry, Competitive Cyclist, and Scott Bikes. And from that distance, a few years ago, he wrote this really, really interesting postmortem on LinkedIn about the Weagle and Chain Reaction and kind of the bike industry in general. And it went as viral as things do in the bike industry. And it was really interesting and widely shared amongst the bike industry professionals. And I spoke to him about that in the last series. So Jake is now working outside the industry, and he's very brutally honest about his assessment of the industry and the supply chain as a whole, and very insightful, I found. What he describes isn't just a COVID problem. He's one of the few people in this series who's willing to say the inventory problem existed well before 2020, and the pandemic just lit it up. Rereading your LinkedIn article, one thing that really stood out to me was when you said capacity never actually leaves the way it should. And I didn't quite understand that when we first met, or understand it in the way that I guess you meant it. And I think I do now. And we have this benefit of hindsight, and we're seeing, who you used to work for, Cigna, or as people would know it, Weagle, CRC. They've stayed gone and disappeared. But, you've seen, the big three and other Big cycling brands like, the Trek specialized in giants and other brands still very much alive despite brutal conditions. But then you've also seen the likes of Kona and YT, their founders have bought the brands back and restart. Has anything actually changed in your view, or is the industry just kind of repeating the pattern you described?
What I mean, I guess in more detail, when I say that capacity never leaves like it should, typically in an industry like you would have shareholders, the owners of the capital, like they would have a required rate of return, right? That should be commensurate with the risk that they're taking, to partake in that business. And there's, generally speaking, the return on invested capital calculations don't math out relative to the risk that they end up taking. And so I think in the cycling industry, there's other industries as well that are like it, but you certainly see it in the cycling space. You get very, very passionate, capital owners, people that want to partake in the industry and live in the industry. But in doing so, you wind up with a situation where it's actually pretty high barriers to exit. People never actually exit like they should. I think you've seen that perpetuate itself, certainly like you've seen a lot of the founders of brands that have like bought things back. By all numerical rationality, they should just take the cash and go bury it in their backyard, and they'd probably be better off. But that, that's not how us humans live. Passionate about the space, they want to be in the space. But it creates a dynamic for the industry where, you have some pretty intense and kind of nasty competitive dynamics that show up because of that, right? You sort of have like the barriers to entry have like lowered for that market over the years, since probably even before the 2008 crisis, but certainly post like 2008 financial crisis. You have about 12 years where there's just nothing but super cheap capital, right? So capital's very cheap. At the same time, access to contract manufacturing over in Asia, that's just expanding. So all of a sudden, like, you don't have to know how to like make the stuff at scale anymore. You can hire someone else to do that. And so that just kind of like really lowers the barriers to entry, while the barriers to exit emotionally stay where they're at. And so I think that, it's just kind of created a dynamic across many of the different categories in the space where you wind up with super, super intense competition. And then at the same time, when you do have you pursue that contract manufacturing, you're going overseas, your lead times become super, super long. With longer lead times, you're trying to predict demand over a longer span of time, which is inherently more difficult. Then on top of that, because of all the intense competition, it sort of promotes an over-optimism bias, people perpetually over-ordering. So even before the COVID, the pandemic and kind of the onslaught of all the inventory overage after that, the industry had an inventory problem well before that. We've, not that I'm in the space anymore, but certainly when I was in it, everyone conveniently didn't talk about that and talked about, well, COVID did all this, and this is all from COVID. And it's like, you guys, there was a systematic pattern of over ordering prior to COVID. I feel like we shouldn't ignore this whole lesson and remember that, I think that there was over ordering behavior happening well before the pandemic.
So the someone else mentioned to me that this has always been a problem. The pandemic just shone a spotlight on it and exposed the problem.
Yeah, without a doubt. Yeah, and I think the industry hasn't done itself any favors in that it's always been very, very focused on the cost of underage. I don't want to be short. I don't want to be short units, because that's missed revenue, that's missed profit, that's missed sales. The industry is it's a very, very fragmented value system. And when I say that, I mean, you think about, let's just talk about a bike, ignore the other categories for a second. A bike itself, I don't know, 50% of the value is actually sitting in branded components and parts that are kind of hanging on this thing. That's sort of unique for a very, very high price point product or industry. Usually the fork or the drivetrain or the seat post or, the saddle or the bars, there's not that much branding that's going on in the components of a car, for example. There's a ton of branding that's sitting in all these different things that are hanging off of this chassis.
In the bike.
Yeah. And as a result of that, if a bike sells for $10,000, that $10,000 gets split up amongst like bunch of different businesses, right? It gets split up kind of all over the place. More so than take a dirt bike, for example. And because like that value concentration is super fragmented, you wind up in a result, where like many different businesses have to support, their fixed cost structure, with a smaller concentration of dollars that are kind of getting like split up all over the place. And the industry doesn't do itself any favors by also kind of promoting spoilage, going back to what I was saying a minute ago, everyone's always focused on the cost of underage, but the cost of overage is actually quite high and people ignore that. And the cost, of holding that one incremental unit, because like the cost of goods, there's a really, really high percentage of the revenue that's sitting in cost of goods. And people tend to ignore what that cost of overage is. And COVID really exploited it. People obviously felt it like, oh, I see what it's done to my balance sheet now when I'm really, really heavy in inventory. But again, this was a problem prior to COVID.
What would capacity leaving look like in practice? What does that mean, the harsh reality?
Consolidation of brands, elimination of brands.
Mm-hmm.
There's just, it's too many, it's too much.
Yeah.
Across the spectrum. Too many brands, too many sales folks, too many marketers, too many product people, too many engineers. It's sad, right? Like if consolidation were to occur, like it's sad and it's hard, and that's probably why it doesn't happen. But as a result, you wind up with like many different brands all competing for a pool of demand that's not really increasing that much.
Jake's point about consolidation, that is, there are too many brands competing for a pool of demand that isn't growing. We kind of hear that all the time. And that's the most unsentimental version of what might need to happen. And he's right that it probably won't, because passion keeps capacity alive that economics would have already killed, as he says.
Yeah, it's a very tricky situation because, like Jake has pointed out, there are so many brands with almost similar products. It's really hard to convince anyone what's your value proposition to them. What's the new product that is going to convince someone to buy a new bike right now? I believe Ellery had something to say about this too in your interview with her, and what needs to change for people to come back to paying actual full price for new products.
Yeah, let's hear what Ellery has to say about that.
My POV at the time was like, when we see those enthusiasts returning to, I'm going to pay sticker price because that new technology is like, that's the only way I can get it. Like, I want the new technology. That's going to be, I kind of saw that as sort of like the canary in the coal mine for like, okay, things are going to kind of start to trend towards normal, because if I'm getting full margin and my manufacturer is getting full margin, then we're headed back to a more like normal, like retail environment, let's say pre-COVID retail environment, where a certain percentage of your sales every year were going to be full margin sales. In the rearview mirror, in thinking of my response to you about that, I think I was like technically accurate that was going to be one of our signs, but I overlooked one problem with my own answer, which is actually a big problem for the bike industry right now, which is there isn't that much differentiation in the new technology. So my idea holds true in like the bike industry, where a bike drop was like, whoa, that Geo super progressive, or like that drivetrain's amazing. But like we were starting to actually see, at least among the technology, which was our kind of niche, the bikes that were our niche, which was full suspension, mountain biking, and gravel riding. In the higher end, we were seeing almost like, I hate to use this word, but a homogenization of technology, where technology differentiation used to be something that drove those full margin, early adopter, I want that bike type sales. Geometries are kind of pushed as far as they can go. And, you notice I slowed way down when I said an opinion about geometry, right? Because there's entire podcast
Yes.
series in the world dedicated to bike geometry. And so I'm sure I poked someone's traumatic wound by saying that Geos have been pushed as far as they
Ellery,
can go.
we have 32-inch wheels now. Have you heard that? There you go. It's a new world.
I know.
You got out too early.
No, you know what? No, I disagree. Wait, it needs to be flicky and fun. We're going to 25 inches. Like, 25.4.
Yes.
25.4.
Yes.
That's it. That's the magic number. But so we saw that, like, actually, I mean, bikes kind of started riding so similarly. And they did. I mean, I was riding them all. I was riding all the new stuff that came in. I'm like, well, that bike rides great. That bike rides great. That bike rides great. And, like, technology differentiation is actually way harder. I mean, look at e-mountain bikes, right? Like, they've all kind of, it used to be like all these different concepts about like the motor and battery combos and like the power unit. And it's slowly kind of like by attrition. We were talking about like one or two major motor systems.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's even a bit homogenized. Right. And it's like, oh, this one's super, super lightweight and this one's not. And then, it's all kind of settled around this like tolerable weight for a battery and a motor that weigh that much.
Yeah.
Right. And we're getting these tiny incremental gains. Right.
Which is really inevitable, isn't it?
It's inevitable.
Until a whole new genre of cycling comes along, like say gravel, which is still evolving at quite a rate, it seems, but leveling off.
Yeah. Like I remember a big deal with one of our brands in 2020 was that all the rear triangles were now universal derailleur hanger compatible. And I'm like, and you launched a whole bike around that? Like, like you launched a whole bike around a UDH hanger or, like a universal rear derailleur hanger like that. I'm not sure that's a whole new product. That happens all the time. And so as things get like really, a dropper seat post, when the dropper seat post first launched, that is a mic drop product launch, right?
Yeah.
Like that is like a whole new functionality. So that's kind of where you're saying like, unless we come up with a whole new genre or a new technology. But what I guess my pushback on that a little bit is like, yes, but the bike industry is incredibly famous for characterizing a tweak as a new genre or a mic drop, when really we just put a suspension fork on a gravel bike.
Yeah.
And calling it like a whole new
thing.
And
then it's funny. I could list 20 of these sort of progressive new things that like disc brakes on road bikes. Like that was just an absolute sin. And there were people with cut open forearms and it was just like, these are going to kill us. And it's like, I don't know where those have gone. Like, why isn't that happening still? Like the market is so resistant to change too. Maybe from a road bike perspective, not as much from a mountain bike, but yeah, we're a fickle, crazy bunch.
Yeah, I think, well, I don't know that there's resistance to change in road biking. It's just a product that has less relevant changes to be made.
Yeah.
Like there's fewer moving parts.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There's fewer moving parts.
Yeah. And there's so much look and tradition in that side of the sport as well. Like mountain biking, you're still figuring everything out. And gosh, the amount of times things have been sliced and diced differently is quite refreshing. And I like to see these things, but yeah.
No, I do too. And I mean, and mountain bikers are inherently like the sport. The founders of the sport were inherently disruptive.
Yeah.
I mean, they were taking bikes that were meant to be ridden in one way and they were riding them in another way. So, it's kind of sometimes hard to separate that. But we also had a very large gravel business. And so I think we still kept ourselves connected to like a drop bar environment. And we kept ourselves connected to, let's say, a traditional road ethic. Even though I definitely am not the bike shop owner that you would have come to talk to about the Giro d'Italia because, we were really kind of focused on our disciplines. You still do see some of the same, like, slower to adopt change.
Yeah.
We still kept connected to a drop bar ethic through our gravel program.
What Ellery said there goes for the whole industry, and we'll for sure talk more about the tech innovation, or maybe the lack of it, in the coming episodes. It's an interesting one because there's really, really great bikes in the market. Most of them are really excellent. You and me, Wade, we both know it. We ride great bikes at the moment.
Yeah.
But to move the stock, the brands do have to come up with something to draw the attention of the customers. They have to come up with some kind of new innovation. But then at the same time, you also have the old model sitting in the warehouses. And then you have a problem that is only getting worse and worse. And the big question is, how do you get out of all that?
Yeah, very true. And Jake's framing of the situation, perhaps the darkest, but maybe most honest, that capacity isn't leaving. And brands that might otherwise go under are being kept alive by passionate owner-operators who love bikes. And, you know, we like to say that's kind of the charm of the bike industry. But sadly, it's also potentially one thing not so healthy about it as well, I guess. And that keeps pressure on everybody else.
Very true.
In the next episode, we shift from the false dawn to what's actually structurally changed and what is keeping much of the industry from really getting its head above the water. We haven't finished editing episode 2 yet because what we found in the last series was that many people came out of the woodwork with stories of their own experiences. If you have anything to add and want to speak, please email us at overnightsuccess@escapecollective.com with your story or insights. We'll keep that 100% confidential until you agree to share, we promise. We won't be able to respond to all emails, but we absolutely read all of them, and we always welcome any feedback, of course. If we end up deciding to proceed with your story, we'll be in touch. Thanks for listening, and the next episode, entitled The Ground Shifted, will be out in a couple weeks. This episode was edited and produced by Red Bricks Media.